Hi, it's Rob. Welcome to the next video in the AWS Amplify playlist. In this video, we'll use AWS Amplify Studio to build a full-stack web application. If you followed along with the prior videos in the playlist, you'll recall we spent a considerable amount of time in Visual Studio Code and in a terminal issuing commands via the AWS CLI. However, with Amplify Studio, we're presented with a web UI in which we can quickly and easily scaffold and deploy a web application with minimal coding involved. Some features of Amplify Studio are the ability to configure a scalable application backend by extending AWS services and using Amplify libraries, building React UI forms, accelerating web application development, and the ability to deploy and host your application in Amplify. In this video, we'll be using Amplify Studio to build a version of the Contacts app we worked with in the prior videos in the playlist. As previously mentioned, a feature of Amplify Studio is the ability to accelerate web UI app development. And one way this is achieved is to use the design to code approach by importing a Figma prototype into Amplify Studio as React code. So this is the minimal coding I mentioned earlier. Now, to get started with this approach, you'll first need to create a Figma account. So let's head over to figma.com, click the Get Started button, go ahead and provide your information, create the account, and then log in. Go ahead and choose the Start for Free option. Then I'll get started on my own. Okay, now that we have our Figma account set up, we could start working with Amplify. And from here, I'll click the Get Started button. Then the Get Started button to build an app in Amplify Studio. I'll give the app a name of Contacts app, then confirm my deployment, and wait for Amplify Studio to initialize. Then I'll click Launch Studio. From here, I'll go ahead and click the Create Data Model button to create the data model for the contacts in the application. And if you watched the prior videos in the playlist, you'll recall that the contact data model has the following properties. So I'll go ahead and create them in Amplify Studio. So to get started, I'll click the Add Model button, give the model a name of contact, and in addition to the default ID field, I'll add a new field for name, which will be of type string and is required, a field for email, which is also a required string, a field for cell, and a field for the profile pic path. Then go ahead and save and deploy the model. And after some time, we'll see that Amplify Studio used CloudFormation to provision a DynamoDB table for us. And if we jump over to the DynamoDB dashboard and go into Tables, we'll see our contact table was created. Now that we have our contact model created, we can actually use Amplify Studio to populate it with some dummy data. So from here, I'll click Content, then Actions, and Auto Generate Data. I'll specify 3 records to generate, and then click Generate Data. And here we can see 3 contacts were created for us. And if we go back to DynamoDB, jump into our table, and explore table items, we see our 3 records. Back in Amplify Studio Data Manager, if I click one of the rows, we see I have the ability to edit the data. And I'll go ahead and do the same for the other 2 rows. And if I additionally wanted to create other rows myself, I could use the Create Contact button. But for now, we'll stick with the 3 auto-generated and edited contacts. Okay, with our data model created and populated with some data, let's turn our attention to our UI. So I'll go ahead and click the UI Library button. Then I'll click the Sync with Figma button. Then click the Use our Figma template to get started link. From here, I'll go ahead and click Get a Copy. And now I have a copy of the AWS Amplify UI kit for Amplify Studio in my Figma account. Now, over on the left, we'll see that the README file is selected, and this is what you're seeing displayed in the center pane. So go ahead and pause here, zoom in on any of these templates in your own Figma account, and read through them for more info. Then over on the left, we have primitives, which display the various elements we can use in our design. And under primitives are my components. And these are the actual page components we'll use to build our site. And the very cool thing about this is that we can actually edit these components in Figma and then import them into Amplify. So to do that, I'll go over to Share, click Copy Link, then go back to Amplify Studio, then paste my link to Figma and click Continue. Here I'll allow Amplify Studio access to Figma. And then I'll accept all changes. And accept all. And now inside my UI library, I have access to the UI primitives, the theme, forms, and components. And now that these are imported, if I go back to Figma and find the profile card, I could double click to edit it, change the title to Contact, and the text on the button from View Profile to View Contact, then go back to Amplify, find the profile card, then sync with Figma again. And we can see our changes from View Profile to View Contact. So I'll go ahead and accept the change. And now in our list of components, we see a contact in our updated component. So now we see that we can build our UI in Figma, then import it into the UI library in Amplify Studio. Now, to save some time in the video and to spare you from having to watch me fumble around in Figma to create the UI elements, I've gone ahead and made some modifications to the Amplify UI kit. First, I deleted all the components that I won't be using in my application. Then I've renamed the components that I will be using, which consist of a navigation bar, a form to add a contact, a form to edit a contact, and a card to display the contact. Now, with this done, I'll jump back over to Amplify and sync with Figma to pull these changes in. And now we see our updated Figma components in our Amplify UI library. And with the components looking the way we like, and with our data model built, we can move on to the next step, which is binding the component elements to the fields in the data model. So to get started with the contact card selected, I'll click the Configure button, select the card, and then the profile picture element. Here I'll click Set Image Source, and then from the contact model, select the contact's profile pic path. Then I'll select the contact name element and set the text label equal to the contact's name, and the email equal to the contact's email, and the cell equal to the contact cell. Now I'll go back to the UI library, click the Add Contact form, then Configure, select the form, and then the Save button. Here I'll click Set On Click Action, then scroll to the bottom, and under Data, select Create, because when we submit this form, we want to create a new contact. I'll select the model, which is contact, and now I can bind the fields from the model to the fields on the form. So here for name, I'll select contact name, for email, contact email, for cell, contact cell, and for profile pic path, I'll select the contact profile pic path element. Now I'll go back to the library and do the same for the edit contact form. I'll select the Save button and then bind an on-click action to the data's update function. I'll select the model, then bind the model elements to the component. Next, I'll go back to the library again. This time select the contact card, click Configure, and here what I'd like to do is create a collection. I'll give it a name, and this will allow me to display a collection of contact cards on my web page. So I'll go over to the layout and click Grid. I'll indicate I want 3 columns, and then I'll add some spacing. I'll click to include search and pagination, and leave the default page size of 6. Then go back to the library, find the nav bar, click Configure, then select the image next to contacts. Here I'll set the image source, and instead of selecting from the data model, what I want to do is provide a link to the icon image I have stored in an S3 bucket. So I'll jump over to S3, copy the object's URL, then go back to Studio and paste that value in as a string. And now we see our logo applied. The image on the right will be dynamically populated with the user who logs into our application to create and view contacts. And we'll do that later in the code. Now I'll go back to the library again, click on the contact card collection, and our cards are looking pretty good, except that our profile pictures aren't displayed. So what I'll do is I'll jump back into content, and I'll edit each of the rows and update the profile pic path to point to images I have stored in S3. So I'll click the first row, then jump over to S3 and grab the object URL for contact number 1. Go back to Studio, paste it in and submit, and do the same for the other 2 contacts. Now let's go back to the library, and we see our profile images displayed in our contact cards. All right, now with our data model created and seeded with dummy data and our UI component elements bound to the contact model, we're ready to pull the React code, which will be generated by Amplify, down to our local machine. So to do that, I'll jump into a terminal and scaffold a new React application using Create React App. Now, if you've been following along in the prior videos in the playlist, you'll already have the Amplify CLI installed. However, if you haven't yet installed it, go ahead and execute this command, npm i-g, to globally install the AWS Amplify CLI package. I've already done this, so I'll move on to the next step. First, I'll change directory into the Contact App application folder, which was just created by Create React App. Next, I'll use npm to install the AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify UI React packages. And now I'll jump back into the Amplify Studio console, and in the upper right, click Local Setup Instructions. Here I'll copy the Amplify pull command, then go back to the terminal and execute the command to pull the configuration down to the local machine. This will open up a window and allow us to confirm that we want to log into the Amplify CLI. So I'll click Yes, then go back to the terminal. And here, since I'm using Visual Studio Code, I'll just hit Enter for JavaScript, Enter for React, and then take the rest of the defaults. I'll answer yes for modifying the back end. And now I'll launch Visual Studio Code. Here, I'll start out by going into the public folder and doing a little bit of cleanup. So I'll delete all the files except for the index.html. Then I'll open the index.html file and change the href of the icon to point to a file in S3. Then I'll delete down to the title and change the title to Contact App. And finally, delete the comments. Now I'll jump into the source folder, delete the app.test.js file, the logo SVG, report web vitals, and setup test.js. Now I'll jump into the index.css file, and at the top, import the fonts for Amplify. Then I'll go into the index.js file, delete the import for web vitals and the code at the bottom, and add imports for Amplify. First, I'll import the Amplify CSS, then I'll import config from AWS exports, which was created when we pulled from Amplify Studio, as well as import Amplify and the Amplify provider. I'll pass config to the Amplify configure method, and then replace React strict mode with the Amplify provider, and save the file. Now I'll open up the app.js file, delete the imports for the logo and the app CSS, and then replace the HTML and the app functions return with a React fragment. Now, what I want to do is add element tags for the React components generated by Amplify. And if we go back into the Amplify Studio console, those will be for the nav component, the add contact form, the edit contact form, and the contact card collection. So I'll add the elements as well as the imports. Now I'll save the file, jump back into the terminal, and launch the app using npm start. And here we see our components loaded in the web page. However, this isn't obviously how we want the page displayed. For starters, we want the nav bar to extend the entire width of the page, so we can fix that by jumping back into VS Code, and in the nav component, adding a width attribute with a value of 100%. We'll save the file and jump back into the browser, and we see our change applied. Also, by default, we don't want the add contact and edit contact forms displaying on the page. So let's jump back into the code, and I'll add contacts for is adding and is editing contact, which will use React state. So I'll jump to the top and import useState from React. Then around the add and edit contact forms, I'll add code to see if I'm adding a contact, and if is adding contact is true, I'll display the add contact form. And do the same for is editing contact, displaying the edit contact form if is editing contact is true. Now, let's save the file and go back to the browser, and we no longer see our forms by default. The contact cards are displaying, which is what we would want to see by default if there are any existing contacts. And although we only have 3 contacts created, we do see pagination, and I'm able to search. So right now our page is in pretty good shape. However, if we start clicking on some of the buttons like add contact or edit and delete, there's no functionality yet implemented. So that's what we'll work on next. And we'll start with the add contact button. When I click this, I want the add contact form to display. So let's jump into the code, and I'll create a constant named nav overrides. And this will be used as the value of a property which is passed into the nav component. And what the overrides allows us to do is override default behavior for elements in the component. Now, if we go over to the UI components folder and expand it, and then find the nav.jsx file and search for add contact, here we see it's a button with an override property name of add contact button. So I'll copy this, then go back to my app.js file, and inside the nav overrides object, I'll paste it in and add an on-click event handler which executes a function to set is adding contact to true. So if we save this and then jump back into the browser, reload the page, and now click the add contact button, we see the add contact form is displayed. However, if I click the X to close the form, nothing happens. So let's jump back into the code and take care of that. So inside the UI components folder, if I open the add contact form component, here I see an icon element with the override name of vector. So I'll go ahead and copy this, then add an overrides for add contact, specifying the vector and giving it a value for an on-click event handler, which will set is adding contact to false. Then I need to jump down to the add contact form element and add an overrides property with a value of the add contacts override. Now I'll save the code, jump back into the browser, refresh the page, add contact, and now when I click the X, the form is closed. And now I'll do the same for the edit form. So when I click the edit button, I want the edit form to display, and when I click the X on the edit form, I want it to close. So let's jump back into code, create a constant for edit contact overrides, then go into the edit contact form component, find its icon and validate that the name is vector, then add an on-click event handler, which will set is editing contact to false. Now we have an on-click, which will close the edit contacts form, but we still need to display it. And to do that, we'll scroll down to the contact card collection and modify the element. For starters, because the contact card collection is paginated, I'll add the is paginated attribute and items per page attribute, setting its value to 6. Then in the case of the collection, we'll be working with multiple items instead of a single button. So in this case, the property will be override items, which will return an overrides object. And if we go into the contact card component and search for the edit button, we'll see that the name of the override component is edit contact button. So I'll copy this, paste it in, and add an on-click handler, which will set the is editing contact constant to true. So let's save the code, go back to the browser, reload the page, click the edit button, and we see the edit contact form. And if I click the X, the form doesn't close because we need to go back to the code and add the overrides pointing to the edit contact overrides in the edit contact form component. Now let's save the code. Go back to the browser, refresh the page, click edit, and now close. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually test adding a contact. So let's click on the add contact button and complete the form. I'll give the contact a name, an email, a cell, and add a link to a profile image I have in an S3 bucket. And then I'll click save. And if we scroll down, we see our contact was added. Now let's go ahead and try and delete a contact. So I'll jump up to the first contact, and if I click the delete button, nothing happens. So in order to address this, we need to jump back into the Amplify console, select the contact card element in the UI library, click configure, and then select the delete button. Here we'll set the on-click action, scroll down to data, select delete, set the data model as contact, and then for the ID, we'll select the contact ID. Now let's jump back into the terminal, stop the app, and execute an Amplify pull to pull down the changes. Now I'll start the app again and click the delete button, and now we see the contact is gone. I'll do it again, and let's just refresh the page, and now we see our two contacts. Okay, so next what we want to do is work on the edit functionality. So when I click edit and the form comes up, I want to be able to enter this information, click save, and then see it updated on the contact. However, in order to do this, I need a way to tell the contact form which contact I want to update. So let's jump back into the code, and I'll scroll to the top and create a constant for the contact to update. Now I'll scroll back down and call the set contact to update method to set the contact equal to the current item. And the current item will be passed in to the function for the override items. So now I'll save this, go back to the browser one more time, click edit, fill out the form, click save, and nothing happened. And that's because even though we called set contact to update, passing it the item, we need to pass that item as a contact into the edit contact form. So let's save this, go back to the browser, refresh, edit, fill out the form, now click save, and our contact has been updated. All right, so we're in pretty good shape here. We have an app which will create, read, update, and delete contacts, which really required very little coding on our part. Now, the next step is going to be to add user authentication to the application. So a user will have to create an account, then log in to work with their contacts. And we only want specific users to see the contacts that they created, not all the contacts which have been entered into the application. So let's jump back over to Amplify Studio. I'll click on authentication, and here I'll leave the default for configure login to login using email. Then in configure signup, I'll add attributes for preferred username, email, and profile, which will be a URL to the user's profile picture, and then deploy. Now I'll jump back over to the terminal, do an amplify pull, then head back over to the code. Jumping into the nav component, there are two more overrides that we need to work with. One is the logout button and the other is the user profile pic. So going back to the app.js, inside of the nav overrides, I'll add an override for the logout button and bind its onClick event handler to be an asynchronous call to a signout function. And then I'll call clear on the local data store to clear out any contacts which may have been stored in the browser between various users logging in on the same device. Now, this signout functionality is provided to us by importing with Authenticator from AWS Amplify UI React. And to work with the data store, we'll import data store from AWS Amplify. Now, for the with Authenticator component, we want to grab that, scroll down to the bottom, and pass our app into with Authenticator. And then in the app function declaration, we'll pass the user object and the signout method. Then finally, for the user profile pic element, we'll set its source equal to the user who we passed in's attributes of profile, which is the URL to the profile pic path for the authenticated user. Now, let's save the code, go back to the terminal and start the app. And now when the browser reloads, we see we're prompted to log in. Well, first we'll create an account. So click create account, then enter your information and create the account. Now check your email and enter the confirmation code and confirm. And now we're logged in and we see my user profile pic. And if I click log out, we're logged out of the application and prompted to sign in again. And when I do, we're re-authenticated and we see our two contacts. However, these contacts weren't created by me as a current authenticated user. So in this case, I only want to see the contacts that I create. So to address this, we'll jump into Amplify Studio, and under Data, I'll select the contact model and then enable owner authorization. And I'll allow the owner to create, read, update, and delete the contacts. And then under anyone authenticated with the API, I'll remove this rule. Then save and deploy. Then jump back into the terminal and do an amplify pull. Then restart the app, log in, and we no longer see any contacts. So let's go ahead and add a contact and save, and we see our contacts added. Now I'll go ahead and edit, and maybe the contact wants to add her middle initial and full name to the email, and if we save, we see the contact information was updated. And finally, we'll test the delete and log out of the application. So that concludes this video on using AWS Amplify Studio to build a full stack web application. If you found it useful, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.